My name is Brendan, and I've been attending Turning Leaf Church for a little over 2 years now. New Christian as well. I accepted Christ back in November of 2013 and decided to kind of get over my selfishness, at least of thinking that I can control my life. And I decided to give it to God and let Him help, and help He has in a lot of ways. I've struggled with adult magazines and adult videos and stuff for a very long time. I think I was probably somewhere in around the age of 5 or 6 when I found a first magazine in my house growing up. It was kind of hidden under a couch cushion, and going from that moment on, it's just something that I've always kind of had a need to look at, I suppose, all through my childhood, and even through a young adulthood as well. It was never really a protected thing. It was just kind of more or less left out to be found. So there was never really, for me, anything that was stopping me from looking at that material. And I think for a long time, not knowing how to relate or have anybody to talk to about it, it kind of consumed me for many years.
I grew up without much self-esteem or self-worth. I think that's probably the biggest reason that his pornography addiction hurt so much for so long, because I was always afraid that I wasn't good enough, that he would continue to choose other things over me and eventually leave me. Those were personal issues that I had to work through on my own with God. I remember one day not long after I was saved, I went to the altar, and I had given over everything in my life to Him at that point, except my marriage. I still thought that I could control what my husband was doing, that I could deal with everything on my own. And I eventually realized that I couldn't. It was at that point that I went to the altar and I just said, Lord, I'm ready to end my marriage, and I don't know what to do from here. I never wanted to get divorced. I have always been in love with my husband, but I couldn't take the continual hurt anymore. I couldn't take the pain, the empty promises, the lies, just feeling emotionally alone in my marriage. And as I wept at the altar and I just prayed, Lord, take this from me, heal my marriage, give me the strength to love my husband, give me the strength to just do what I need to do. And it felt like time just kind of stood still for a moment. And all of a sudden I just kind of felt this peace that it would be okay. And I felt that He gave me the verse, Ephesians 4:29-32. And He said to me, He said, you can't talk mean to Brendan about this. You can't argue with Brendan anymore about this. You have to get rid of all of your bitterness and your anger and your hurt. You have to be kind and compassionate, because Jesus died for his sins the same way that He died for yours. It was kind of in that moment that I really learned how to be able to really extend grace to Brendan and not let his sins consume me, because I couldn't carry the burden of his sins any longer.
And if we go, we several years now married, and I decided to, my heart was starting to soften from my non-belief that God existed, having grown up the whole time, not ever really going to church. And I knew then that I had to make a change in my life, otherwise this cycle would continue through our whole marriage. And that wouldn't have been fair to my wife, or even to my children, where I'm trying to teach them and establish a proper way of living, but deep down inside and in secrecy, I'm nowhere near that. Completely broken with that. I accepted Christ in my life And I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility now to honor my commitment to God and know that, you know, His love was going to be poured onto me. So I made it a commitment at that point to not use that. But I think in my commitment to not use adult type websites and magazines, it was more of out of, well, that's what the right thing to do is. You don't look at that stuff. You're a Christian now. You're supposed to be better and not sin. And I did a really good job at that for quite some time. But again, that cycle of one time here and there isn't going to hurt. And it just brings back that whole vicious cycle of not going to do it, I'm going to do it, I didn't get caught, so I'm just going to do it again. And it just, even though I was a believer now and going to church and became a church member and baptized, I still it just kept on coming back up in my life. And it was really difficult because I had an amazing wife that loved me despite my issue with being addicted to adult magazines and websites. And yet I thought I could do better for her, and I couldn't. I was constantly breaking her heart. And I think for me it was a time to really buckle down and change. You know, almost 2 years removed from accepting Christ in my life, I finally just, instead of trying to control the situation myself and be that person thinking that I can do this on my own, I broke down and talked with Pastor about my situation. He started helping me with some resources of some books to read. And I really had a great conversation with my wife. I think the key thing for me was to really open up and be as honest as possible about what I'm facing and what kind of led me to this point in my life. And she was extremely supportive. And that was the last part of July was the last time that I've ever really looked at. It's the last time I've looked at anything related to that, because I gave it to God. I finally said that this is enough. If I'm really going to make a change in my life and to have the right marriage model for my kids where there's no lying, there's total trust in each other, and being true to God and to what He calls us to be, then I had to let control of it go and just ask God to be the one to guide me through this struggle.
Well, happy Valentine's Day. I'm sure that some would say, boy, that's a bad timing, to do it on a day like today. But you know what? There is no greater gift you can give to your spouse than purity. And I think even though maybe it makes us uncomfortable and maybe it's a subject we don't want to talk about, particularly on Valentine's Day, it's one that needs to be had, not only in the side of the church, but it needs to be had in families, and something that God can do something with. That God can redeem all of those things, and God can make something new and fresh in you. And so that's my hope today, is that today is the beginning of something new in many lives that would allow God to do something that is going to restore you in relationship with God and restore your relationships and your marriages. The leaves on the tree behind me, we're in this series called Rooted. And we've talked about the roots that God wants us to grow deep, the faith and love and hope and grace. And on the leaves, you've written all of those leaves up there, or the majority of them at least, you've written on. And they talk about things that you hoped would come out of those roots going deep in your life. You also wrote some things down about what God would want to do in you to help you be more consistent in certain areas. And so this is only going to be up 2 more weeks. And so I want to encourage you to get a photo of it and remember it, and remember what God has done in your life through this. So some of the outcomes that we've talked about are consistency, and last week Dr. Birch talked along the line of obedience. And so today we're talking about purity. Now, you've heard part of Brendan and Tiffany's story, and you have a little view of what's gone on in their lives and in their marriage. But, the truth is there are many forms of impurity in people's lives. I think sexual sin and sexual addiction tends to be one of the hardest ones to overcome. It's one of the more shameful ones that we deal with. I was thinking, as I was writing this, that we've talked a lot on the news lately about the Zika virus, right? And all that's going on with that. And I don't want to downplay it too much, because for unborn children, pregnant women, it's a serious thing. For the majority of people, it has really very little effect on them. And yet it's in the news every day. But a subject like pornography, which is a virus and a plague that has spread throughout the entire world, never gets talked about. Or if it is talked about, it's talked about almost in a sense of, well, everybody does that. Well, it's okay to do that. You ever hear a news article that talks about the problems of pornography or the problems of sexual sin? No. Nobody wants to talk about that. And so we need to find a way to get this subject out in the open, starting in the churches and then going out from there. You've heard most of the statistics on pornography. It's the largest business in the world. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. And any business that starts out and grows, it wants to grow more, right? So how do you grow more? You increase your market. And so pornography increases their market by introducing it to children at a younger and younger age. Parents, did you know that 25% of porn sites have brand names in them such as Barbie, Disney, Nintendo, NBA, so that when your kids search those words for legitimate sites, some of those porn sites could potentially come up also. Pornography is no longer just a guy issue either. They are saying in more recent studies that 28% of women admit to being addicted to pornography. And 34% of women admit to going on to porn sites intentionally on a fairly regular basis. Now, all that being said, this sermon is not going to be only about pornography and sexual sin. What I want us to get across, and what I want us to all step into, is to allow God to cultivate a pure heart within us, because that's where it has to start. Like Brendan said, he buckled down, he did his best, he even as a Christian, he knew what was right. It wasn't enough. And it wasn't until God began to do an inner work inside of him that God was able to release him and free him from that. And so I want us to talk just a little bit about that renewal in a pure heart. Now, here's what I want to say, though, before I just leave the pornography issue. If you're struggling, will you come and talk to me? Will you just set up a meeting with me and just talk to me about it? I can give you some direction. I can give you some material to read. I can hook you up with some other guys who are working on being free from that. I just can't do all that in one sermon. And that's not the base issue anyway. It's a pure heart is the base issue. But I want you to come and talk to me and get on the road to freedom and begin to know that there's hope for your life and there's hope for your marriage in these areas. Purity is defined as free from foreign or inappropriate elements. Okay? So that could mean sexual sin, but that could mean a whole host of other impurities. And in Galatians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul gives us a whole list of impurities in our lives. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and my favorite, and the like. So that if you weren't covered in one of those, and it's like that, then that's you too, okay? Those are just some impurities. Now, your impurity, whatever it is, you may call it a little nicer name than that. Maybe debauchery and all those words, or, well, I don't know what that is. So you call it by a nicer name, a name that's a little more socially acceptable. I get angry sometimes. I sin sometimes. You don't always like to name that sin. But that impurity is still there, and it still eats away at your heart, and it limits your relationship with God, and it limits your relationship with others. John Wesley said, "A very little dust will disorder a clock. The least sand will obscure our sight. So the least grain of sin which is upon the heart will hinder its right motion toward God." It doesn't take very much, just a little bit. And it doesn't have to be obvious. In fact, most of the time it's not, right? We do a very good job of hiding our sins. It's not obvious, but it's enough to slowly wear you down, to slowly bind you up, and to make you ineffective in God's kingdom. But a person with a pure heart, too, is not just a person that looks good on the outside, that does all the right things. Because a person can do the right things. Some personalities lend themselves to pleasing other people. You know, they want to be looked at as good people. And so they can keep themselves sometimes from doing the bad things, but in their heart they may still be very far from God and from the right attitudes and the right things that He wants to put in them. One author said, purity is about being something. Abstinence is about not doing something. I would much rather be pure than just not do something just because it's bad. I want that pure heart. Matthew Henry says, purity is being inwardly as good as you seem to be outwardly. Inside out purity. So the question that we typically ask is, well, how do I get rid of this impurity in my life? But I think the better question to ask is, how can I let God bring to me a pure heart? How can I let Him develop that in my life? If you want a pure heart, ask for it. King David, when he sinned with Bathsheba, he said to God in Psalm 51, "Create in me a pure heart, O God." He asked for it. I don't know where I learned it, but the best thing I've ever learned about prayer is that it is the best and the first thing that you can do. And so if you know that there are impurities in your life, you know that your heart is not pure, ask for it. Say it. Pastor Matt was talking a couple of weeks ago at our night of worship about breath prayers. Just prayers you can pray in a moment when you're in trouble, when things are rough in your life. What a better prayer to pray. Create in me a pure heart, O God. Create in me a pure heart, O God. But then you might find that there's times when you have a little more time to say a little bit more. So why not take all of these verses that surround it? Create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit in me. Cast me not away from your presence. Take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Memorize that. Pray it. Pray it in the morning. Pray it before you go to bed at night. Pray it whenever you can, and ask God to do something new and fresh in your heart. If you want to have a pure heart, ask for it, but also ask God to deal with your thoughts. You know, our thoughts are our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. Nobody knows, nobody thinks just like you. Nobody knows your thoughts. Psychologist Nancy Collier says, the thought appears in front of and within only you. And that's right. So nobody can read our thoughts. We're the only ones that know it. But she says, without the juice of your attention, it simply disappears without a trace. Anybody say amen to that? Well, that's the way. You know, when I'm writing a sermon, I'm typing away and I'm writing a sentence, and I've thought of this really great thing to say next. But by the time I get there, it's gone. My sermons would be so much better if I could just remember that next thing that I was just thinking about. Because if we don't give energy to those thoughts, they flee from us. So that can be good or bad. But sometimes what happens is there are negative, impure thoughts that are just floating through our minds, and we're not recognizing them. They're just constantly there, and they shape us. They make us who we are. But on the other hand, there can be thoughts that come into your head that you can't get rid of, right? It's just like there's neon light flashing. You want so badly to not think of whatever that is, but you can't get rid of it. There was a medicine man who was selling his elixir, and he said, this elixir will heal every disease. It'll solve every infirmity in your life if, when you take that medicine, you don't think of the red monkey that's on the label of the bottle. Well, who cannot? You see the label and you see the red monkey, so they were never able to prove whether the elixir worked or not, because nobody could say that they never thought about the red monkey. It's hard to not think about things. Part of cultivating a pure heart is to begin to think correctly. And Paul talks about the renewing of our mind. Now, you can also say that out of a pure heart will come pure thoughts. So which comes first? Well, I say that they happen concurrently. So as you are learning to think correctly, your heart is being purified. As your heart is being purified, so you learn to think correctly. It all happens at the same time. And we all know that we can't not think of the things that we don't want to think about. So the Apostle Paul gives us direction. He says, if you're stuck, if you've got all these negative things in your mind, then change the way you think. Change about these things. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. So if sexual temptation comes into your mind and you can't get rid of it, think true thoughts. Hey, I'm married. Hey, I don't want to hurt my wife. I love my wife. I don't want to live in all the shame and all the self-hate that comes up when I do those things. Or if anger comes into your mind and you're just enraged with anger, think about the good qualities of the person you're angry at. If you can't do that, think about the good qualities of Jesus and your relationship with Him. Think about things that are right, that are true, that are lovely. If you're consumed with jealousy over someone, begin to thank God for all of the good things that He's given you in your life. All of the blessings that He's poured out on you. All this great relationship that He has for you. And let go of the competition, of the desire to have something that God hasn't given to you. So ask for it. Ask for a pure heart. Ask God to deal with your thoughts, and ask God to do that deep work of going into your heart and dealing with your heart motives. We sang a song earlier based on Psalm 24. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in His holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart. So those first verses, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord, he's talking about true and proper worship. Who can come before God and worship Him? It's the person who God has dealt with in their life. The person who has both clean hands and a pure heart. Now, clean hands are important. The things we do matter. So this is saying, get your hands out of the cookie jar. Get your hands out of things that are dangerous for you. Get your hands off of things that you know you shouldn't be dealing with. But he's saying also, let God develop in you a pure heart. Those deep motives that are inside of you that nobody else knows about. Just like nobody knows what you think, nobody really knows the true motives of your heart either. It's not just what I'm doing or what I'm not doing, but what is my heart motive? What do I really believe about that thing? What would I do if I knew I wasn't going to get caught? Does my heart agree with God? My motives? Or am I just doing things because that's what I know I'm supposed to do, but my heart's dark and my motives are impure? Because when that happens, then we are what Jesus calls whitewashed tombs. Clean on the outside, look good to other people, dead man's bones on the inside. Death, stink, grossness. Let God deal with your motives. So the pure heart comes from establishing those roots, right? That's what we're talking about, the outcomes. So the establishment of faith and hope and love and grace. Now, as I've thought about it more, I think that root of grace is one that sort of intertwines with all of those others. And we've already said that all of those roots really intertwine with each other. But I was listening to a sermon last weekend at this retreat that I was leading worship at, and Dr. Busick said that grace is the seasoning, it's the salt that we put on everything to make it tasteful. And so I envision that grace is kind of like a fertilizer of all of those other roots that are just being formed and going deep. In the same way, I see purity as having to thread through all of those other outcomes. Because your outcome of consistency or obedience, or next week we're talking about surrender, or any other outcome that comes from those deep roots, purity has to be in all of those. Because if not, then all of those other outcomes, as good as they may seem, as good as they may look on the outside, they're tainted with an impurity that's in your life. And it affects, just like I was saying, earlier, that relationships that have happened years ago affect today. Well, the impurities in our life affect everything. Today, tomorrow, 10, 50 years from now. And so we've got to deal with those impurities in our life. Let God create in us a pure heart. Let Him change us deep inside of ourselves. And so if we're cultivating a pure heart, then that puts us all on the road of progress, right? Because I don't think any of us can say, I have no impurities in my life. And the thing is sometimes we look at certain impurities and we say, ugh. God looks at every impurity and says, ugh. He hates them all. There's none that's better or worse. If our heart is impure, we're no better than anybody else. And so God's wanting to deal with us. Not, you can look at it and say, well, my thing is not that bad. If it's something between you and God, it's bad. It's bad. And you need to deal with it, whatever it is. Some are more obvious, some are less socially acceptable, some affect other people more. But any impurity, we need to get out of our life. And we need to let God form that pure heart in us. So let me just say one more thing about sexual immorality. There's some things that are going to be coming up in the next few months. I'm going to form some groups, and I want guys and girls in separate groups to experience freedom, to find accountability and support from others. Those of you that were at the Orangewood Church, you know about the For Men Only groups that we had over there, and they're still going, and it's an effective ministry, and we need to do something about this. If statistics are right, and what kills me is that the statistics that they're talking about, it doesn't really matter, church or non-church. It's just all there. Okay, so it's all happening. So there's some things coming. But I say that to just give you some direction, but don't wait till then. It's got to start now by asking God, give me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit in me. I invite you to bow your heads just right where you are. Make sure you're not distracted. And I want to invite you to just, in your own spirit, just speak to God and admit your impurities, whatever they are. You don't have to say them out loud, but just say them to God, because there's value in recognizing them and facing them straight on. And now, if you're willing, I want you to just say with me, create in me a pure heart, O God. Will you say that with me? Create in me a pure heart, O God. Say it again. Create in me a pure heart, O God. Will you ask Him to deal with your thoughts? Will you ask Him to deal with your heart motives? The ones that nobody can see, the ones that nobody can know except God and you. And as you ask Him to purify your heart, there's something going on. You may not see it in this apparent reality, but in the spiritual realm, something's happening. Something good is happening in you. And God's going to bring you to freedom. And so I want you to thank Him for what He's doing. Maybe this is the start. This sure isn't the end. This is the beginning of something new. Lots of days ahead of tough work. But God's starting something new. So will you thank Him for it? Will you thank Him for the newness, the hope, the direction? Father, we love You, and we're asking You to do a big thing right now in our lives. Give us clean hands, but give us a pure heart also, God. Thank You for all that You're doing. Amen.